The conference room fell silent when he walked in. Major Eric Castellanos moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been rebuilt more than once, each step a deliberate negotiation with pain that had become his constant companion. The scars traced up his neck like lightning frozen in flesh, disappearing beneath his collar, reappearing at his jawline. Purple and raised, they caught the fluorescent light in a way that made junior officers look away. He was used to it. The whispers, the stares, the subtle shift in posture when people realized he wasn't just another desk officer riding out his 20. He carried his daughter's lunch in one hand, his briefing folder in the other, because Maya had forgotten it again that morning, and single parents didn't get the luxury of forgetting small things. The other officers were already seated, most from the newer generation, the ones who'd only seen conflict through drone feeds and satellite imagery. They looked at him like he was a relic, something broken that should have stayed broken. One captain, Voss, smirked and muttered something to his neighbor about walking wounded taking up space. Eric heard it. He always heard it. Then the door opened again, and the room snapped to attention. Brigadier General Naomi Cahill entered with the kind of presence that didn't need announcement. She was Pacific Islander, built like someone who'd grown up throwing nets and reading ocean currents before she ever touched a cyclic. Her uniform was immaculate. Her ribbons told stories that made career officers weep with envy, and her eyes scanned the room with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to assess threats at 300 knots. Her gaze passed over faces, dismissive, professional, until it landed on Eric. She froze, not the polite pause of recognition, true, physical freezing like someone had cut her hydraulics. Her eyes locked onto something most people never noticed, the small unit insignia on his collar, partially obscured by scar tissue. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Night Stalkers. The ones who flew into places that didn't exist on maps, retrieved people who were never officially there, and came home to silence and classification. Her hand went to her own collar, unconscious, where an identical insignia sat. The room felt the shift, the sudden weight of something unspoken. Voss stopped smirking. Cahill's expression cycled through shock, recognition, then something that looked almost like grief. She crossed the room in 4 strides, ignoring protocol, ignoring rank, and stood directly in front of Eric. Her voice, when it came, was rough, unsteady. "Dust Angel." The call sign hit the room like a flashbang. Eric's jaw tightened. He hadn't heard that name in 4 years. Not since the fire. Not since the valley. Not since everything went wrong and the only thing that mattered was getting his crew out, even if it meant flying a burning helicopter through a canyon at night with half his instruments gone and his co-pilot screaming. Cahill's eyes were wet now, openly, and she didn't care who saw. "I was Overwatch 7, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "June 16th, Kandahar Province. You pulled my team out of a hot LZ with your bird on fire and your fuel lines severed. You flew 18 minutes on fumes and prayer while we extracted under contact. I watched your tail rotor disintegrate. I watched you set down in a riverbed and walk away from a crash that should have killed everyone. I wrote the citation for your silver star myself, and they classified it so deep I couldn't even tell my own family what I'd seen." She wasn't looking at the scars anymore. She was looking through them, past them, to the person underneath. To the pilot who'd chosen his crew over his own survival, who'd absorbed fire and kept flying, who'd become a single father because his wife couldn't handle what the war had left behind. Eric said nothing. Words felt inadequate. Maya's forgotten lunch was still in his hand, a bright pink container with butterflies on it, absurd in this moment of military gravity. Cahill turned to address the room, her voice hard now, command voice, the one that had ordered strikes and saved lives in equal measure. "This man is the reason 12 soldiers went home to their families. This man is the reason I'm standing here. And if I hear one more word, one more whisper, one more disrespectful comment about scars earned in service, I will personally ensure your next assignment is counting MREs in Alaska." The room had transformed. Voss looked like he wanted to melt into his chair. Other officers stared at Eric with new eyes, recalculating, reassessing. He was no longer the broken thing taking up space. He was something else now, something they couldn't quite comprehend but instinctively respected. Cahill's expression softened again as she looked back at Eric. "I didn't know you were stationed here. I didn't know," she trailed off, seeing something in his face that answered unasked questions. The divorce, the custody battles. The nights when Maya asked why Daddy couldn't turn his head all the way or why he flinched at loud noises. The slow, grinding reconstruction of a life after heroism had taken its payment in full. "I'm managing," Eric said quietly, which was both true and a monumental understatement. The briefing proceeded, but nothing was the same. Officers who'd ignored Eric now listened when he spoke, because Cahill deferred to his experience on air support protocols, on risk assessment, on what it actually meant to fly when everything was falling apart. She transformed him from invisible to essential with a single story, a single truth. When the meeting ended, Cahill held him back. The room emptied quickly, officers suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere, and in the silence that followed, two night stalkers stood across from each other, separated by rank but united by something deeper. "How bad is it?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the scars, at him, at the weight he carried. "Bad enough," Eric admitted. "Good enough." She understood the duality, the pain that never stopped, the pride that never faded, the knowing that you'd done something that mattered even if it cost you everything. "Maya?" Cahill asked, surprising him with the knowledge of his daughter's name. "She deserves better than a father who can't coach soccer or turn quickly or sleep through the night. She deserves a father who's a hero," Cahill countered, "even if she doesn't understand it yet." Eric held up the pink lunch container. "Heroes remember lunches." Cahill smiled genuinely for the first time since entering the room. "The best ones do." She pulled a card from her pocket, official, embossed. "I'm establishing a new training program, experienced combat pilots teaching the next generation. Real scenarios, real decision-making. I need instructors who have been there, who can teach more than flight mechanics. I need people who understand what it costs." Eric took the card, feeling its weight. "I'm a logistics officer now. I push papers, I coordinate supply chains." "You're a night stalker," Cahill corrected. "That doesn't stop just because the Army reassigned you. That doesn't stop because you got hurt saving lives. I'm offering you a chance to fly again. Different bird, different mission, but still flying." The possibility settled over him like sunlight through storm clouds. Flying. Not as a pilot anymore, the injury had taken that, but as something else. As someone who could stand in a briefing room and say, "This is what it looks like when everything goes wrong, and this is how you survive it anyway." He thought about Maya, about the stories he'd eventually tell her when she was old enough to understand. That evening, Eric sat on his apartment balcony while Maya did homework inside, the card from Cahill resting on the railing beside him. The sky was darkening, the kind of deep blue that preceded true night, and somewhere overhead he heard the distant thrum of rotor blades. A black hawk, probably, running night training patterns over the base. He knew that sound intimately. Knew the pitch and rhythm, the way the blades cut air, the vibration that traveled through the airframe into your bones. He'd lived inside that sound for years, had made it an extension of his own body. And for 4 years, since the crash, since the fire, he'd tried to forget how much he missed it. Maya appeared at the door, her small frame silhouetted by the apartment's warm light. "Daddy, you okay?" She was 9, old enough to read his silences, young enough to believe he could still fix anything. "Yeah, baby, just thinking." She crossed to him, climbed into his lap with the unself-conscious ease of childhood, careful of his left side where the scarring was worst. She'd learned early to be gentle there. About flying. She was too perceptive for 9. Eric wrapped his arm around her. About teaching people to fly. She considered this seriously, her face scrunched in concentration. Like a professor, like a pilot who knows what matters. Maya traced one of the scars on his neck, something she did when she was thinking, a gesture that used to make him uncomfortable but now just felt like love. "The kids at school say you got hurt in the war." "I did. They say you're a hero." "Heroes are just people who kept going when stopping made more sense." She looked up at him with eyes that held his whole world. "Then you're definitely a hero, Daddy, because you keep going every single day." Out of the mouths of children came the truths adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Eric kissed the top of her head, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, apple, and something floral. This was what he'd saved. Not just the 12 soldiers in that valley, not just the mission, but this quiet moment, this small person who believed in him completely. When he'd walked away from that burning helicopter, his flight suit melting into his skin, his co-pilot screaming, his crew unconscious from the crash, he hadn't been thinking about medals or recognition. He'd been thinking about missing Maya's first day of school, about her growing up without a father, about the promise he'd made when she was born that he'd always come home. He'd kept that promise. It had cost him his marriage when his wife realized the man who came home wasn't the same one who'd left. It had cost him his career trajectory, because pilots with nerve damage and limited mobility didn't get to fly anymore. But he'd kept it. He came home. The next morning, Eric arrived at the base before dawn, the way he used to before missions. The sky was that peculiar shade of gray that promised sunrise eventually but hadn't committed yet. He found Cahill in the operations center, already working, coffee in hand, reviewing flight patterns on a massive display. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked without looking up. "Old habits." She gestured to the screen. "New pilots, graduating flight school in 6 months. They can fly technically. They know procedures. But they don't know the other stuff. The instinct, the fear management, the split-second choices that don't appear in any manual." Eric studied the training schedules, the curriculum, the pristine progression of skills building on skills. It was good training. It was also completely divorced from reality. "They need scenarios," he said, "not simulations, real decision trees with incomplete information and competing priorities. They need to know what it feels like when the plan falls apart." Cahill finally looked at him, evaluating. "That's why you're here. You've lived through the plan falling apart. You've made the impossible choices. These kids need to learn from someone who's been there, who carries the proof." She didn't mean the scars, not exactly. She meant the weight of decisions made under fire, the responsibility of other people's lives, the knowledge that sometimes there are no good options, only less terrible ones. Eric spent the morning reviewing the training program, identifying gaps, imagining scenarios. By lunch, he had a rough outline of what real combat aviation training should look like. By evening, he'd written a proposal that would either revolutionize pilot instruction or get him laughed out of the training command. Cahill read it in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls. Within a week, Eric had an office, a position, and a classroom full of young pilots who looked at him with curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. They saw the scars first, always the scars. The way his left hand shook slightly when he wrote on the board, the way he moved carefully, deliberately, like someone navigating invisible obstacles. They were young, fresh, confident in the way only people who haven't been truly tested can be. Lieutenant Carrie Akanjo sat in the front row, her posture military perfect, her notebook open, her expression polite but distant. She was the top of her class, the one everyone expected to be exceptional. She'd grown up on Air Force bases, had wanted to fly since she could walk, and approached everything with methodical precision. She looked at Eric and saw an instructor, just another requirement to complete. Eric started without introduction, without preamble. "June 16th, 4 years ago, Kandahar Province. I was flying a Black Hawk designated as Dust Angel 7. My crew was 3. My mission was extract a reconnaissance team under heavy contact. Simple on paper. We'd done it 100 times." He paused, letting them settle in, letting them think this was going to be a war story, something entertaining. Everything went wrong in the first 90 seconds. He pulled up a map on the screen, detailed topography of a valley system that looked like broken teeth. The LZ was compromised. We had enemy fire from 3 positions. My co-pilot took a round through his instrument panel. Shrapnel severed our hydraulic lines. I had about 4 minutes before the bird became unflyable. Carrie was taking notes. The others were listening now, leaning forward. The team on the ground was pinned. 6 operators. They'd been in contact for 40 minutes and were down to their last magazines. Extraction was their only option. But landing meant exposing my crew to direct fire in a helicopter that was already dying. He let that sit, let them imagine it. What would you do? The question hung in the air. A few hands went up, tentative. Eric pointed at a young pilot named Matthews. Sir, I'd request alternate extraction. Find another LZ. No time, they'd be overrun in minutes. Next. Another pilot, Chen, spoke up. Get close air support to suppress the enemy positions first. CAS was 10 minutes out. These operators had maybe 3. Next. Silence. They were starting to understand that every option had consequences, that time was the real enemy, that decisions in combat weren't about finding the right answer but choosing which terrible outcome you could live with. Carrie's hand rose slowly. Eric nodded to her. You land anyway, she said, her voice steady. You accept the risk because that's the mission. Those operators are depending on you, that's why you're there. And if your crew dies because of that choice, Eric countered. If you land and take a rocket and everyone burns, Carrie's jaw tightened. Then they die doing their job, but if you don't land, those operators definitely die. The math is clear. The math, Eric repeated softly. You think it's about math. He turned back to the screen, pulled up another image. A photograph, grainy, taken from a cockpit. Flames visible on the airframe, smoke obscuring the instruments, the ground rushing up at an angle that made several students gasp. This is what math looks like at 200 feet with your bird on fire and your co-pilot screaming and 6 people depending on you to do something impossible. The classroom was absolutely silent now. I landed. I got them aboard. And then I flew a helicopter that was actively burning, with no hydraulics, no tail rotor authority, and fuel pouring out of severed lines, for 18 minutes across hostile territory, until I found a place to put down that wouldn't kill everyone when we crashed. He touched his neck, the scars unconscious. This is what those 18 minutes cost. My co-pilot lost his left arm below the elbow. My crew chief has permanent lung damage from the smoke, but all 12 of us walked away, eventually, after the surgeries. Carrie was pale now, the others looked stricken. This wasn't the sanitized version of combat they'd imagined. This was real. The question isn't what you do, Eric continued, his voice gentler now. The question is what you can live with afterward. Because if you survive, you have to carry those choices forever. The people you saved, the risks you took, the consequences that rippled out from a decision made in seconds. He let that settle, watching understanding dawn on their faces. This course isn't about making you better pilots. You're already good pilots. This is about making you into people who can make impossible choices and still function afterward, who can lead, who can sacrifice, and who can come home to their families at the end of it. The morning session continued, but the dynamic had shifted. They weren't students tolerating a requirement anymore. They were people confronting the reality of what they'd signed up for, what the uniform actually meant when everything went sideways. During the break, Carrie approached Eric's desk. Up close, she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with eyes that hadn't seen enough yet but wanted to. Sir, can I ask, do you regret it, landing knowing what it would cost? Eric considered the question carefully. Every day, he admitted, and I'd do it again exactly the same way. She nodded slowly, processing. My father was a pilot, Air Force. He died when I was 12, training accident, mechanical failure. He could have ejected, but he stayed with the plane to steer it away from a residential area. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Eric heard the weight underneath. He made the choice. And you're trying to understand it, Eric said, trying to know if you're capable of the same thing. Yes, sir. That's why you're here. That's why this matters. Carrie returned to her seat, and Eric saw Cahill watching from the back of the room. She'd been there the whole time, observing, evaluating. After class, she joined him in his office. You've got them, she said simply. They'll listen now, they'll learn. They're scared, Eric observed. Good, fear is honest. Overconfidence kills. She pulled up a chair, settled in with the ease of someone who'd shared countless briefings and debriefings. I've been thinking about that day, the valley. I've been thinking about why you didn't die. Luck, Eric said automatically. No, Cahill's voice was firm. Luck doesn't fly a burning helicopter for 18 minutes. Luck doesn't maintain formation with no instruments. You made a series of perfect decisions under impossible conditions. That's not luck, that's something else. Then what is it? Love, she said, surprising him. Love for your crew. Love for the operators depending on you. Love for the idea of going home to your daughter. People think combat aviation is about aggression, about being fearless. But the best pilots I've known flew with love. They loved their people too much to fail them. Eric had never thought of it that way. He'd always framed it as duty, responsibility, training. But sitting there, he realized she was right. In that valley, burning and falling and fighting for control, what had driven him wasn't duty. It was the fierce, desperate love of someone who refused to let his people down, who refused to orphan his daughter, who chose to burn rather than abandon. "Is that what you tell your pilots?" he asked. Cahill smiled. "No, I tell them about tactics and procedures, but you can tell them about love. You've earned it." The weeks progressed and Eric's class evolved. He stopped teaching flight mechanics and started teaching decision-making. He brought in scenarios without clear solutions, situations where the right choice was whatever you could live with afterward. He taught them about fear management, about staying functional when your body wanted to freeze or flee. He taught them that heroism wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Carrie emerged as the star student, not because she was the best flyer. Several others had superior technical skills, but because she understood the human element. She asked the uncomfortable questions. What do you do when you have to choose between mission and crew? How do you live with the ones you couldn't save? What does command feel like when people die following your orders? Eric answered honestly, even when the answers hurt, especially when they hurt. By mid-semester, word had spread about his class. Senior officers started sitting in on sessions. Other instructors adapted his scenarios. The training command began restructuring their entire curriculum around the principle that combat aviation was fundamentally about people, not machines. Cahill watched it all with quiet satisfaction. She'd taken a broken pilot and given him a new mission, and he'd exceeded every expectation. But more importantly, she'd given him back his purpose, the thing that pain and injury and loss had tried to steal. One evening, after a particularly intense session where they discussed a real Black Hawk crash in detail, Carrie found Eric in his office. She was holding her phone, her expression troubled. "Sir, I need advice, personal advice." Eric gestured for her to sit. "I'm engaged," she began. "To another pilot. He's amazing. We met in flight school. But after your classes, after hearing what happened to you, to your family, I'm scared. I'm scared that this life, this career, it destroys relationships. That I'm going to have to choose between being a good pilot and being a good partner." Eric leaned back, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue. "My marriage ended because I couldn't stop being what the war made me. Because I brought the missions home, the nightmares, the hypervigilance. Because my wife signed up to marry a pilot, not a casualty who happened to survive." Carrie looked stricken. "So you're saying I should choose?" "No," Eric said firmly. "I'm saying you need a partner who understands what this costs, who sees you at your worst and stays anyway, who knows that some nights you won't sleep, that some days you'll be somewhere else in your head, that you'll carry things you can't talk about. My ex-wife couldn't do that. It wasn't her fault, but it meant we couldn't survive together. How do I know if he can handle it? You don't, not until it's tested, but you can be honest with him about what you're learning here, about what scares you, about the choices you might have to make. If he runs, better now than after you've built a life together." Carrie nodded, absorbing this. "Your daughter, does she understand?" "Not yet, but she will. I'm saving the story for when she's older. For when she asks why Daddy looks the way he does. And I'll tell her the truth. That I chose to come home to her, whatever the cost." Tears welled in Carrie's eyes. "That's beautiful, sir." "That's survival," Eric corrected gently. "Beauty is optional, coming home isn't." After she left, Eric sat in the darkness of his office, watching the base lights flicker on as evening deepened. He thought about the version of himself from 5 years ago, the one who'd been confident, whole, unbroken. That man was gone, but something else had emerged from the burning wreckage. Someone harder, yes, more scarred, definitely, but also more real. More present, more aware of what mattered. The instructor position, which had seemed like a consolation prize, had become something else. A way to ensure that what he'd learned, what he'd paid for in fire and pain, wasn't wasted. Every student who graduated his course carried a piece of that knowledge. a piece of that night in the valley, a vaccination against overconfidence, a reminder that heroism was just human beings refusing to quit even when quitting made perfect sense. Cahill found him there, sitting in the dark. She didn't turn on the lights, just sat in the other chair, two veterans in comfortable silence. "They're talking about making your course mandatory for all combat aviation students," she said finally. "Not just pilots, crew chiefs, gunners, everyone who flies." Eric processed this. "That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who will be better prepared because of you, who will make better choices because you taught them that perfect solutions don't exist, that the job is about mitigating disasters, not preventing them." "Heavy burden," Eric observed. "All the important ones are." They sat together as night claimed the base, as duty shifts changed and new crews took over, as the endless cycle of military life continued its rotation. Somewhere overhead, Eric heard rotors again. Always the rotors, the sound that defined his past and apparently his future too. Maya was waiting when he got home, sprawled on the couch with her homework, the TV playing something animated in the background. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening in that way that still made everything worth it. "Daddy, guess what? I got an A on my history project." She launched into an enthusiastic description of her presentation on local veterans, complete with hand gestures and sound effects. Eric listened, fully present, remembering what Cahill had said about love. About how the best pilots flew with love, not fear. He'd spent 4 years thinking the crash had taken something from him. His health, his career, his marriage. But sitting there, listening to Maya describe the Revolutionary War with 9-year-old enthusiasm, he realized the crash had also given him something. Clarity. Purpose. The understanding that every morning he woke up was a choice he'd made in that valley, a refusal to quit that echoed forward through time. The scars weren't badges of honor. They were reminders, maps of a moment when everything had been on fire and falling apart, and he'd chosen to hold on anyway. Chosen to keep flying when flying was impossible. Chosen to come home when home seemed unreachable. That was the lesson he taught his students, though most of them wouldn't understand it fully until they faced their own valley, their own burning moment of truth. But when that moment came, they'd remember. They'd hear his voice saying there are no perfect choices, only choices you can live with. And maybe, just maybe, they'd fly with love instead of fear, and make it home to their own bright-faced children who believed in them completely. The semester concluded with a final exercise, a full-scale simulation that Eric had designed with brutal honesty. Multi-ship formation, hostile environment, mechanical failures cascading through the flight, and incomplete intelligence about enemy positions. No perfect solutions, only hard choices. Carrie's team drew the scenario first. She was aircraft commander, responsible for 3 other helicopters and their crews. Eric watched from the control room as the simulation unfolded, as systems failed according to his carefully programmed chaos, as the radio filled with urgent voices and competing demands. She handled the first crisis well, maintaining formation, when her number 2 aircraft reported hydraulic problems. She handled the second crisis adequately, rerouting when the planned LZ came under fire. But the third crisis, the one Eric had designed specifically to break through training and touch something real, that one stopped her cold. Her wingman's aircraft suffered catastrophic engine failure. They were going down. She could either maintain mission timeline and leave them, or break formation to provide security during their emergency landing, which would compromise the entire operation and endanger the operators waiting for extraction. The simulation froze, waiting for her decision. In the control room, other instructors leaned forward. This was the moment that defined pilots, the choice that revealed character. Carrie's voice came through the speakers, steady despite the chaos. "Ghost 2, this is Ghost Lead. We're not leaving you. All aircraft break formation. We're securing the emergency LZ. Mission timeline is secondary to crew survival." She'd chosen her people over the mission. The simulation continued and the consequences played out. The operators on the ground took casualties waiting for delayed extraction. Carrie's decision cost lives, just in a different column of the ledger. When the exercise ended, the room was silent. Carrie removed her helmet, her face pale but composed. She knew what she'd done, knew what it meant. Eric let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of command, the burden of choices that had no right answers. Then he spoke, his voice carrying to every student in the room. Lieutenant Akanjo just made the hardest decision a pilot can make. She chose her crew over the mission. Some of you are thinking she failed, that the mission is paramount, that soldiers on the ground died because she prioritized her own people. He paused, making eye contact with each student. But here's what really happened. She made a decision she could live with. She chose not to abandon her people. And that choice, that willingness to accept mission failure rather than leave crew behind, that's what builds the kind of unit cohesion that wins wars. Because now every pilot in her formation knows, absolutely knows, that she won't leave them. That if they go down, she's coming. That loyalty runs both ways. Carrie's eyes were wet, but she held his gaze. The operators who died, sir, that's on me. Yes, Eric agreed, not softening it. That's on you, and you'll carry that. Every commander carries the cost of their decisions, but you'll also carry the knowledge that you brought your people home. Both truths exist simultaneously. Welcome to leadership. The class ended and students filed out in unusual quiet, each processing what they'd witnessed. Cahill appeared at Eric's shoulder. You broke her, she observed. And then you built her back stronger. She broke herself, Eric corrected. I just provided the scenario she chose, like you chose in the valley, like I chose. The academic year concluded with a ceremony, routine and military, full of speeches and commendations. Eric stood in the back, uncomfortable with attention, watching his students receive their certifications. They were different now. Harder, yes, more aware of costs, but also more prepared, more honest about what they were capable of and what they weren't. Carrie approached after the ceremony, her parents in tow. Her father, she told Eric, her real father, the one who died steering a failing aircraft away from homes. This was her stepfather, a kind-faced man who clearly adored her. Sir, this is my family. I wanted them to meet you, to understand what this course meant. Eric shook hands, made small talk, the social ritual that veterans performed when they'd rather be anywhere else. But then Carrie's stepfather said something that stopped him. She was angry for years after her dad died. Couldn't understand why he didn't just eject, why he chose the plane over coming home. Your class, what you taught her, it finally gave her peace with that. Thank you. Peace. Eric hadn't considered that his teaching might offer that. That night, alone in his apartment while Maya slept, Eric pulled out a box he kept in his closet. Inside were the classified citations, the mission reports he wasn't supposed to have, the photographs from before the crash. His crew intact and smiling. His co-pilot with both arms. Himself unscarred and naive about what was coming. He looked at that version of himself, the confident pilot who thought he understood sacrifice. That man had no idea. No concept of what it meant to choose burning over abandoning, to fly broken machinery through hostile fire because people were depending on him, to wake up in a hospital weeks later and learn that survival had a price that would be paid daily for the rest of his life. But that man had also been capable of extraordinary things, had made the right choices when it mattered most, had brought 12 people home who would otherwise be names on a memorial wall. Eric closed the box, put it back in its place. The past was fixed, unchangeable, but the future was still being written. Every student he taught, every scenario he crafted, every hard truth he shared, that was his mission now. Not flying, not anymore, but ensuring that the next generation flew better, smarter, more honestly than his generation had, that they understood what it meant before they were tested, that when their moment came, their valley, their fire, they'd be ready to choose what they could live with. Months passed. Eric's class became a permanent fixture in the training command. He taught 3 sections a semester, watched hundreds of students cycle through, saw the ones who got it and the ones who needed more time. Carrie stayed in touch, sending updates from her first operational assignment. She was flying Black Hawks in Europe, training missions mostly, but she wrote about how Eric's lessons influenced her daily decisions. How she thought about love and fear every time she proflit her aircraft. How she told her fiancé everything about the course, about what she might have to do someday, and he'd stayed. They were married now, two pilots building a life with eyes open to the costs. Cahill got promoted, as everyone knew she would, moved to a senior position at the training command. But she kept Eric's course intact, protected it from bureaucrats who wanted to soften it, who thought his scenarios were too harsh, too traumatic. She understood that trauma postponed was just trauma waiting to happen, that preparing people for reality wasn't cruel. It was the greatest kindness a military could offer its service members. One afternoon, Eric got a call from Maya's school. She'd been in a fight, which was completely unlike her. He left work early, his heart racing with parent panic, and found her in the principal's office with a black eye and an expression of fierce satisfaction. The principal explained. Another student had called Eric a freak, had mocked his scars, and Maya had responded with her fists. She was suspended for 3 days, the principal said, because violence wasn't tolerated. Eric should be ashamed. But looking at his daughter, her eyes swelling shut, her jaw set in defiance, Eric felt something else entirely. Pride, fierce and complicated. In the car, silence stretched between them. Finally, Maya spoke. "I know I'm not supposed to hit people. But he said you were ugly. He said you looked like a monster, and I couldn't." She was crying now, fat tears rolling down her cheeks. "I know what you did, Daddy. General Cahill told me. She came to career day at school and she told everyone about the valley. About how you saved people, about how you're a hero. And then that stupid boy said those things and Eric pulled over, gathered her into his arms carefully, mindful of his limitations and not caring. "Baby, you can't fight my battles for me." "But they don't know," she sobbed into his shoulder. "They don't know what the scars mean, they just see ugly." "Then teach them," Eric said quietly. "Use your words, not your fists. Tell them the story. Tell them that ugly is just the price of beautiful things. Tell them that I look like this because I chose to, because coming home to you mattered more than what I looked like when I got here." She pulled back, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Will you tell me the whole story, not the kid version, the real one?" Eric considered this. She was 9, too young maybe, but also old enough to understand that choices had consequences, that her father's scars were a story worth knowing. "Not today," he said. "But soon, when you're ready, I promise." The suspension became family time. Eric took the days off and they spent them together. Museums, parks, movies. Normal things that felt extraordinary because they were shared. On the third day, sitting on a bench watching ducks on a pond, Maya said something that cracked his heart open. "I'm glad you came home, Daddy. Even if it hurt, I'm glad you chose me. Always, baby, every time, no matter what." She leaned against him, small and warm, and his entire world. The scars pulled, uncomfortable, but he didn't move. This was what mattered. This was what the burning had purchased. Not glory, not recognition, just this. This moment. This choice echoing forward. Years continued their steady march. Eric became a fixture at the training command, the instructor everyone had heard of, whose course defined careers. He watched hundreds of pilots graduate, tracked their progress, heard stories of his scenarios, helping them make better choices in real situations. He received letters from operators who'd been extracted by his students, thanking him for teaching their pilots to prioritize people over missions. He received awards he didn't want and recognition he didn't need, because the work itself was the reward. Watching young, confident pilots transform into thoughtful leaders who understood the weight of command, that was enough. Cahill retired eventually, her career complete, her legacy secured. She wrote Eric a letter, handwritten, that sat on his desk for weeks before he could bring himself to read it fully. It talked about that day in Kandahar, about watching his helicopter burning and somehow still flying, about the impossibility of what he'd done. It talked about how she'd carried that image for years, a reminder that humans were capable of extraordinary things when they loved fiercely enough. It talked about how finding him in that conference room, alive despite everything, had felt like discovering a miracle she'd thought lost. She ended with a single line. "You taught me that scars are just visible proof of choices that mattered. Thank you for choosing to live." Eric framed the letter, hung it in his office where students could see it, next to a photograph of his crew from before the crash. A reminder of who he'd been, who he'd become, and why the transformation mattered. Maya grew, as daughters do, into a teenager with her father's eyes and her own fierce sense of justice. She wrote an essay for school about heroism, using Eric as her subject. She interviewed him formally, recording everything, asking the hard questions he'd always known would come. How did it feel to be on fire? Did you think you were going to die? Do you wish you'd done something different? He answered honestly, even when honesty hurt, especially then. The essay won awards, was published in the local paper, found its way online. Eric became briefly famous in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable, but Maya was proud, and that made it bearable. She defended him on social media against trolls who questioned the story, who called him a liar or a fraud. She learned young that heroism made people uncomfortable, that society preferred its heroes dead or uncomplicated, that living with the consequences of extraordinary choices was harder than making them in the first place. Carrie, now a captain with her own command, invited Eric to address her squadron. He flew commercial to her base, spent a weekend teaching her pilots the same lessons he'd been teaching for years. But now they had a new dimension, because Carrie could stand beside him and say, "This man changed how I think about everything. Listen to him." The respect he'd earned wasn't about rank or position. It was about truth, about lived experience, about being living proof that the impossible was just difficult plus determination plus love. One evening, sitting in Carrie's office after a long day of briefings, she asked him a question. "Do you think it was worth it, sir? Everything you lost, everything you went through for what you have now?" Eric thought about his daughter, now 16 and fierce, about his students, scattered across the military, flying with his lessons in their heads, about the marriages he'd helped save by teaching young pilots to be honest about costs, about the lives preserved because someone somewhere had made a better choice under pressure because he'd taught them to think about love instead of fear. "Every day," he said, "and I'd do it again." Carrie nodded, satisfied. "That's what I needed to hear because I'm pregnant, due in 6 months, and I'm terrified that this career, this life is incompatible with being a good parent. But watching you, seeing what you've built with Maya despite everything, it gives me hope." Eric smiled, genuinely happy for her. "It's not incompatible, it's just hard, but the best things always are." On the flight home, Eric stared out the window at clouds below, thinking about paths not taken. He could have ejected from his metaphorical burning helicopter, walked away from the military, found an easier life. But then he wouldn't have taught hundreds of pilots to be better, wouldn't have given them tools to survive their own impossible moments, wouldn't have built a legacy that extended beyond his own experiences into the future, branching and multiplying with every student who applied his lessons. The scars were permanent. The pain was chronic. But the meaning, the purpose that made it endurable, that transformed suffering into something valuable. Maya met him at the airport, driving now, legal and careful and so grown up it hurt. She talked about college applications, about maybe following him into the military, about wanting to fly. Eric listened, feeling pride and terror in equal measure. She didn't have to prove anything, didn't have to follow his path, but if she chose to, he'd make sure she was prepared. That she understood the costs before she encountered them. That she flew with love, not fear. Back in his apartment, familiar and comfortable, Eric made dinner while Maya did homework. Normal, domestic, precious. The life he'd chosen in that valley, the future he'd paid for with fire and pain, it wasn't perfect. His body still hurt. Sleep was still difficult. Some days the memories were overwhelming. But this quiet evening with his daughter, this was worth every scar, every surgery, every moment of doubt. This was the answer to Carrie's question, to every question about worth and meaning and cost. This ordinary moment was extraordinary because he'd chosen it when choosing seemed impossible, because he'd looked at dying and decided living was worth the price. Years continued. Maya went to college, studied engineering, decided against military service but remained fierce in her defense of those who served. Eric taught, semester after semester, watching the military evolve, watching his lessons become doctrine, watching the culture shift toward acknowledging that heroism was complicated and costs were real. He aged as people do. The scars faded slightly but never disappeared. New pilots looked at him and saw a relic until they heard the story. Then they saw something else, proof, evidence, living testimony that the impossible was achievable, that humans could do extraordinary things, that love was a stronger motivator than fear. On the 20th anniversary of the crash, Cahill organized a reunion. The survivors of that valley, the ones who'd lived, gathered at a private venue away from official military scrutiny. Eric's co-pilot was there, prosthetic hand barely noticeable, thriving in a second career as a flight instructor. His crew chief was there, oxygen tank beside him for the damaged lungs, but alive and surrounded by family. The operators they'd extracted were there, older, grayer, but intensely present. They'd built a memorial stone, privately funded with all their names. Not for publicity, just for themselves, for remembering, for honoring what had happened in that valley when everything went wrong and somehow, impossibly, most of them survived. They told stories, laughed, cried, shared updates on families, careers, the beautiful ordinary lives they'd built on the foundation of that terrible day. Eric listened more than he spoke, content to be part of this fellowship of the improbable. As evening deepened, one of the operators, a man named Rodriguez who'd been shot twice during the extraction, stood to speak. I've spent 20 years trying to find words for what Dust Angel did, for what it meant to hear those rotors when we thought we were done, for watching that bird land on fire and knowing someone had chosen to die with us rather than let us die alone. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. But the thing is, he didn't die. None of us did. We all went home. We all got to have families, careers, lives. And that's because one pilot looked at an impossible situation and said, yes, anyway. That's the only eulogy he deserves. Yes, anyway. The group raised glasses, a civilian toast for a military miracle. Eric felt tears on his face and didn't hide them. This was family, the kind forged in fire, bound by choices that transcended normal human connection. Maya had come with him, now an adult, seeing her father in context for the first time. Seeing the people who understood him in ways she never could, who shared something she could only observe from outside. Later, she told him it helped. Understanding that the scars weren't just physical, that there was a whole community of people who carried similar invisible wounds, who'd made similar impossible choices. That her father wasn't broken, just transformed. The reunion became tradition. Annual gatherings, smaller than the first as people aged and life intervened. But those who could came. Because that valley had changed them all, had shown them what humans could do when everything was falling apart. Eric continued teaching until mandatory retirement forced him to stop. His last class was bittersweet, final lessons delivered to students who didn't know they were receiving the last of something precious. He told them the valley story one last time, adding details he'd never shared before, about the smell of burning fuel and how it still made him nauseous, about the sound his co-pilot made when shrapnel took his arm, about the certainty of death and the decision to fight it anyway, about landing hard in a riverbed and watching the fire consume his helicopter completely, flames 20 feet high, and thinking, we made it. About the months of recovery, the surgeries, the physical therapy that hurt worse than the original injuries. About his wife leaving, unable to cope with what he'd become. About Maya's face the first time she saw him after the crash, her tiny hand reaching for his scarred cheek with perfect childish acceptance. He told them everything, holding nothing back because they deserved the truth. Deserved to know what this career could cost and what it could give. When he finished, the classroom was silent. Then one student, a young lieutenant with barely any flight time, raised his hand. Sir, if you could go back knowing everything you know now, would you still do it? Eric didn't hesitate. Yes. Why? Because the alternative is living with having abandoned people who depended on me. Because my daughter exists in part because I chose to survive that day. Because every student I've taught carries a piece of that choice forward. Because meaning matters more than comfort. Because love is stronger than fear. Because heroes aren't special. They're just people who kept going when stopping made sense, and I wasn't done yet. The student nodded, satisfied. Understanding dawned on faces around the room. This was the lesson beneath all lessons. Life was about choosing what you could live with, about deciding what mattered enough to burn for, about loving fiercely enough to do impossible things. After class, Eric packed his office slowly, carefully. 20 years of teaching, thousands of students, uncountable impact rippling out into the world. He took down Cahill's letter, the photograph of his crew, the awards he'd never wanted but kept anyway. He took down letters from students thanking him, from operators who'd been saved by his graduates, from families who had their soldiers because someone had learned to choose differently. The weight of all that gratitude was overwhelming, but also beautiful. This was legacy. Not buildings or wealth, but human beings walking around with better tools for surviving impossible moments. Maya helped him carry boxes to the car. She was engaged now to an engineer who understood about scars, about costs, about the way some families were built on foundations of extraordinary sacrifice. Eric approved, not that his approval was required, but seeing his daughter with someone who understood, who stayed, who chose her knowing she came with complicated family history, that meant everything. They drove home through late afternoon traffic, boxes in the back seat, a career concluded. Eric felt lighter than expected. He'd done his part, taught what he could teach, transformed personal trauma into institutional knowledge. The next generation would carry it forward, adapt it, make it their own. That evening, sitting on his balcony with a beer and his daughter's company, watching the sky darken over the base, Eric heard rotors, always the rotors. A formation of Black Hawks returning from training, their running lights bright against gathering dusk. He watched them fly, clean and perfect, and thought about the pilots inside. Maybe one of his students, probably several actually, given how many he'd taught. They were up there right now, making decisions, managing risks, carrying the lessons he'd given them, flying with love instead of fear. The sound of the rotors faded into distance, but the feeling remained. Connection. Continuity. The knowledge that what he'd started in that valley 20 years ago was still alive, still spreading, still mattering. Maya touched his shoulder gently. "You did good, Dad." "We did good," he corrected. "You and me, team effort." She smiled, and in that smile he saw everything that mattered. The years since the crash hadn't been wasted, hadn't been merely survived. They'd been transformed into something meaningful, something that extended beyond his own pain into practical help for others. That was enough, more than enough. As night claimed the base and stars emerged overhead, Eric Castellanos, former pilot, survivor, teacher, father, sat in peace with his choices. The scars still hurt. They always would. But the pain was just a reminder now, not a prison. A map of the day he'd chosen: love over fear, life over death, meaning over comfort. In the darkness, he raised his beer in a silent toast. To his crew, scattered but alive. To his students, flying with purpose. To his daughter, fierce and proud. To Cahill, who'd seen him when no one else could. To every person who'd survived because someone made a better choice in a critical moment. To the valley and the fire and the 18 minutes that defined everything after. And to the simple, profound truth that heroism was just love refusing to quit. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was why the scars, ugly and permanent, were the most beautiful thing he'd ever earned. Not despite the cost, but because of it.